So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for joining this AI in LA panel. So today we have a variety of experts joining us on the AI in LA panel, and hopefully we have a great discussion about what is the current AI landscape here in Los Angeles, and also general responsible AI or AI questions beyond that. So before we start, let's the panelists to give a quick introduction about themselves. On the screen, left to right, maybe Vince, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Vince. I'm the CEO of IV.AI. IV.AI is an AI platform that's used by companies to make sense of unstructured language information, which basically means we're an NLP platform. So we're really good at taking large amounts of language information and organizing it, and we get used by really big companies like Walmart, Disney, and Samsung. And we're a global company with offices all over the world. And I've been in the AI space for about 9 years and have been an advisor to AI LA for a good kind of 4 or 5 years. I'm really excited to be here on this panel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Vince. Next one, Sarthak, would you mind to go?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarthak Sahu, and I'm the co-head of AI at Virtualitics, where I lead a team of data scientists, machine learning engineers, and AI platform developers that work on creating enterprise AI products and solving challenging machine learning and data analytics problems for our customers. Prior to this, I was a student and researcher at Caltech, where I applied machine learning techniques to many different scientific and industry-centric fields. Great to meet you all, and really looking forward to chatting.
Thank you, Sarthak. Next one will be Violet.
Hey, this is Nanjun Peng, also go by Violet. I'm an assistant professor at UCLA CS department. My research area is natural language processing, NLP, with a focus on natural language generation, where we're trying to teach the machine to generate human language so that we can have smooth and natural conversation. And my work is on the creative or open-ended part of the generation, like dialogue, story generation, or those open world. So their bias and fairness consideration is particularly important. And it's a very challenging problem. Yeah. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you, Violet. And Swabha?
Hi, I'm Swabha. I am an incoming assistant professor of computer science at USC, and I'm currently a postdoc at the Allen Institute for AI. Like many of the other panelists, my focus is also in natural language processing, where I study different ways to estimate dataset quality. This is an emergent field which I have coined as dataset interpretability, where we study large distributions of data to focus on the kinds of biases that there might be present in the datasets, which might lead to the right decisions, but for the wrong reasons. I also study model interpretability, again, with a focus on the biases in the data. And I also study how we can produce higher quality data sets which are exempt from such biases. I'm very excited to be on this panel, and very nice meeting the rest of you.
Thank you, Swabha. So hi everyone, this is Mike Tang. I think I forgot to introduce myself. I'm the moderator on this panel. I'm the associate director at Verizon, leading the responsible AI practice. So very happy to see all of you here. So okay, let's jump on the questions. Let's start with questions that is always near and dear to my heart, as I'm a big believer in education. So this question will be to our professor and soon to be professor, Violet and Swabha. So my first question will be, as responsible AI becomes increasingly important, is this going to change how you teach AI at school, or how do you want your students to look at AI differently? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I can take it. Yeah, I think it's definitely will change the way not only my classroom but also the whole school's classroom. I think it's an issue that is recognized by the department and the school, the engineering school as a whole, that as AI gradually integrate tightly into our daily lives, like how to use it. Like I think previously we're mostly focusing on how to even make this thing work and applicable. But for now, we have something that's roughly applicable, and then with all now these how to make it even better, and then the bias and fairness concern will become very important. So for me particularly, I'm teaching two classes. One is an undergraduate NLP, another is a graduate level NLP. In both classes, I have ended one lecture on the frontiers of the NLP researchers, NLP research on bias and fairness issues, and show the examples of these biases the current models have, and teach them some of these mitigation approaches. So I think it's very important to bring the awareness to the student, and then students actually like this lecture very much. So I think that will definitely or have already changed the way of the classrooms. Yeah, and I think it's a positive change.
Thank you, Violet.
So adding on to everything that Nanyan said, the answer is an overwhelming yes. AI is becoming a fundamental focus, not just in computer science, but also in many different fields. Even though I haven't officially started as a professor, I get a lot of opportunities to interact with students, both at the undergraduate as well as the graduate levels. And it's interesting that even though this is in usually academic settings, there is also a lot of consumption of like the media about AI. And I also get students, particularly undergraduates, who are like very excited about AI because of the whole, media ecosystem that kind of promotes AI as like, the next best thing, which is in many ways true, but in some ways it can also be a little overhyped. So making that distinction clear, like keeping the hype distant from the reality is going to be very important in the classes that I will be teaching. So I will be teaching this fall a seminar class to graduate students about data-centric natural language processing, where this consideration of bias and ethics is going to be front and center. So I want to incorporate a sense of AI ethics right from the get-go as I'm teaching these principles. So it's no longer, like Nanyan mentioned, it's no longer about like if you can solve the problem, but if you can solve the problem responsibly by keeping in mind that you're not inadvertently building systems that can be leveraged by people with ill intents, and developing the sense of taking care of these ethical questions as you are learning and learning to build AI technology.
Got you. Thank you, Swabha. Yeah, I think I hear very common like themes from both of you. This will be a very exciting contents and material that you guys are going to deliver in the classrooms, right? I believe in a academia environment, then you guys have the luxury to bring in not just experts from computer scientists, but also people who are expertise in applied ethics, philosophy, sociology, so that like that students can get different perspective, but not just from a computer scientist, but can also hear from other experts and deeper their understanding of the problem. So yeah, I'm very excited to hear that, and I think the students are very fortunate to have you guys to design the class for them. So now the next question, maybe I return to Vince and Sarthak. So like since the theme, right, of this panel is about AI in LA, so let's talk about what's unique here in LA. So compared to Silicon Valley and other AI hubs around the globe, what's the opportunity or advantage to make LA a ideal place to build AI responsibly?
Feel free to go first, or I can jump in. So I think it's interesting in Los Angeles because it's such a kind of hodgepodge of different industries here in the city, and I think maybe to the point that Violet made earlier about the media's impact on the kind of how people end up feeling about AI, or like how popular it's become. That media is generated from Los Angeles often. Like the character of AI was created here. And even like that Google example with the employee that kind of thought he was talking to a sentient AI because all of a sudden it thought about its life and how it exists and how it might die. Like that's a Hollywood storyline, right? So that was like generated by a brain in Los Angeles that came up with that enough times repeatedly because it's now become a trope. The trope was picked up by the AI. It then became this massive news story that is now massively impacting the industry because it came from the creative, folks here. And that's wonderful from an exposure perspective, I think, as a technologist, when you're building and you're able to be surrounded by these like really interesting creative people that are often using technology as part of their creative art, and therefore kind of thinking about new and elaborate ways of building with technology, and also just happen to be generating a majority of like the content that's being created that is being consumed by these big AI models. I think it's a really prime city for those reasons. But yeah, that's just some of my thoughts on it. I think it's good that, and then obviously great universities to kind of for talent and everything as well. So yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the things that you brought up, Vince, align very, very closely with what I've seen in the LA ecosystem. I think LA has a really unique ecosystem for innovation. I mean, pre-COVID, at Virtualitics, we were able to hire really great talent locally in LA. Through the pandemic, we shifted to a remote first workplace, but even still, there's just a growing number of startups and tech companies with offices or headquarters in LA that creates a really thriving ecosystem for AI. And I love that you brought up the academic side, because I mean, just hearing from Violet and Swabha about the courses that they're teaching at UCLA and at USC and also at Caltech, right? There's just a ton of talent coming out of these great schools that love LA and like to stay here, and so it's really easy to tap into that market as well.
Sounds great. Okay, so I mean, since you mentioned the Google example, I mean, if we have time, we can go back to that later on. But I think that sparked set the stage for the next question, because when I think about AI and last year in particular, here last year I remember like Stanford in particular, they popularized the term, right, foundation models. And then and we have some like experts in NLP in the panel. And for this foundational model, for the audience who is less familiar with that, it refers to a large AI model that trained on a lot of unlabeled data and usually by self-supervised learning, and then resulting in a model that can be adapted to a wide range of downstream tasks. So an early example of that will be like BERT, GPT-3, so and so. Now, foundation models are both opportunities and risk. It can be used in a lot of different places. Language model is certainly one of those. So from the NLP experts' perspective, Violet and Swabha, what are the barriers to embrace those foundation model ideas or apply it with confidence and responsibly?
Maybe I could go first.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know how well known this fact is, but the name foundation models is kind of controversial in academic circles. But without going into that, yeah, so these foundation models are based on these large language models, which have been trained on tons and tons of data, primarily from the internet. But the issues are there. These models are typically trained in large industrial settings, such as your Googles and Facebooks or Metas of the world. And OpenAI, and the access to these language models is pretty limited, as opposed to the previous setup where people used to train their models from scratch and then use the models for their own applications. So this fundamental shift in the availability, the access that corporations versus anybody outside of the corporations has to the language model makes a very big difference. So for instance, these language models may or may not be available for all kinds of academic or non-academic use. So this kind of brings up a barrier to real progress of science. Not to say that someone at Google is scheming up, I will not give access to my model to, this professor from USC who wants to work on this one very academic problem. But it's just that there is a layer of opaqueness that is involved, because all this training happens in these corporations. So you don't know what data these models were trained on. They're typically data just scraped from the internet. And this is not immediately obvious, but their internet is its own bubble, right? There are the majority of the text on the internet is from conversations from these blogs, from places like Reddit, where there might be a certain kind of conversation that's more frequent than other kinds of conversation, a certain kind of content. People who are on the internet are not you might think that everybody is on the internet, but the people who engage in certain kinds of conversation, which generates a lot of this data, that's just a single or a collection of demographics. That's not everybody everywhere. There is a language difference. Yes, you have language models which are built on multiple languages, but the most capable models are the ones in English. So we are not taking into account languages that are spoken all over the world when we are building, or when we are claiming these as foundation models. And the way I think about using this is you could still use these models in your research or in your your industry application settings, but always have an awareness of where these models are coming from. So I would envelop everything that comes as a result from these models. I would contextualize that as this is trained on data from the internet, so there might be a lot of unwanted information. There is definitely a silo in which these models exist, or this information exists. So having that awareness is very important.
Thank you, Swabha. I think that's well said. Enveloping them and then making sure people understand the context, how those models generated, is really, really important. Violet, do you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. First, I want to say that I would definitely agree with whatever Swabha said, and especially the opaqueness, where we don't have access to their data and we don't know what's there. And I think I have an added point is a privacy issue. So there might be those private data. We don't even have a way to examine whether this model could accidentally generate some of these information, some people's private information that happens to be able to find on some of the web, right? So this is the added thing. And then another thing is actually computation, not only the computation of training the model, or it's not accessible for now. For example, Meta have released a public model that everyone can download and can run. It's like 185 billion parameters. The issue is my group, we have a reasonably good GPU in-house. We won't be able to even run that model, run that trend model for the inference time, just because it will require 8 A100 80 gigabyte memory GPUs to run at the inference time. So this not only limited how many people can participate in using this model, but also it creates very high carbon footprint that we should also be aware of. Like we can achieve better performance, but does it worth that a little bit of the better performance to like have a lot of more electricity and other things that are used? So I think how to compress those foundational models so that we have much smaller model size, but still have similar performance, I think it's a very important issue. And then another thing, I would also echo what Swabha said is I would take it as part of the fairness issue, which is we know there are certain language and then even certain culture and then even certain groups are overrepresentative on the web, whereas there are many other languages. I think language is a very good example that are underrepresentative. And when we are talking about foundation models, we're amazed by their English models performance. But how about these other language where my students took some of these multilingual pre-trained model and trying to do some generation on Hindi. In some of the limited cases where the model has been tuned, it can generate well. But whenever we give something that's less familiar to the model or underrepresentative, the model will just generate English as output, although it's claimed to be a multilingual model. When we saw this demo, we saw the output, we were a little surprised. But then after we think about it, it's not a surprise at all, because it's always that's how those model works. It will generate the overrepresentative, no matter its language or the type of pattern or even some of the type of concepts. That's why the bias and fairness issue is so prevalent, because if the data have some of the biases and even distributions, the model will pick it up, and then during the inference time, when it's uncertain, it will just pick the majority rather than like really make rational decision, because they are not yet capable of doing so. So I think these are the major issues that I can see of applying these foundation models for a lot of these applications.
Got you. Thank you, Violet. I think that those are all very important points you guys raised. The accessibility, from my perspective, is very key, right? If people cannot even use or train or use that in the inference time or open the box, right, that contribute to that, then how can we rein in and mitigate potential bias? Like that is a very important perspective from my perspective. And then the next question then, let me see. I think I will turn it back to Vince and Sarthak. Sarthak. I think we have spent some time talking about models, right? So let's talk a little bit about data. As data underpins all the AI processes. So from the industry perspective, what is the role of data in responsible AI? Could you guys give me some, like, share your perspective and some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that was really interesting to hear both from Violet and Swabha is how closely intertwined the problems and the topics in academia are with what we're seeing in industry as well. It makes perfect sense. But Going to your question, right? So data plays obviously an essential role in responsible AI. Any data scientist, it's a common theme with what Violet was just talking about, but any data scientist or machine learning engineer will tell you that what a model learns and what it predicts is solely dependent on the data that was used to train and evaluate the model, right? And so as a result, even when we're really cautious about removing columns like gender or ethnicity or things that might bias the model from a data set, we might still be introducing significant bias into the model if the underlying data itself was not a representative sample covering the whole population. And that's exactly what Violet was talking about just now with the languages that are prevalent on the internet, right? So if you're looking at training a language model and you have a lot of English text, it's going to overrepresent that compared to other languages potentially. And another issue to watch out for is if there are columns or data that the model uses that might be heavily correlated with things that were removed to make the AI more responsible. So for example, even if you removed gender as a column, there might be another feature, another aspect of the data set that actually captures or is very closely tied to gender. And so the model is still seeing and picking up that bias intrinsically.
Yeah, I really agree with all those points that everybody's made. I think they're really important points. I think maybe to add something new is kind of the minute you're putting data in as well, you're making a choice as to which data goes in. And so just by making a choice, you're adding your bias to the situation. And every person has some bias. Like it's just in the way that every model that you build will have bias associated with it. So it's important to consider that, so that when you're looking at the output of a model, it's never kind of 100% accurate. It's like the model said so, therefore let's go and do whatever crazy thing it says. It's really important to consider that it's just a helpful tool to inform decisions and make better data informed decisions and more elaborate ways of processing the information that's available to a person that's making a decision. But ultimately, there's going to be bias that's associated with any model that's built. And even these large language models, to the point that was made earlier, just because the data is on the internet doesn't mean that you're allowed to use the data that's on the internet. It doesn't mean that it was ethically sourced or created when it was put there in the first place. And the fact that it's over-indexing for certain types of conversation or certain types of logic is definitely going to be a part of what gets seeded into the model. If it's just, isn't being tuned and refined, obviously. The thing that I think is important is for when we're going into this new world of kind of, it seemed like the first step of data ethics was, okay, we have all this data and now we're going to be stewards of the data. So we're going to collect the data, we're going to encrypt it, we're going to make sure it doesn't get stolen. That was step one. We're kind of getting there almost. And now the next step is you're using my data. What have I allowed you to use that data for? What have I given you permission to use that data for in relation to how it will be used once you have it? And just because I put it out in the world doesn't mean I put it out for every possible usage of the ways that could happen. I want it to be kind of explicit that the way that the data is going to be used is somehow collected and agreed upon in the contract that the person agrees to, even if it's as simple as a terms and conditions button, that is baked into the process. I think until we get to that stage, the idea of ethical data management is kind of going to be really hard.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Sarthak. So I think we have a few minutes left. I actually prepared another question, but since all of you the same language model and the Google example, Vince, you mentioned early on. So I think probably in some of audience we are also interested to hear some probably relevant discussion about that topics. So I will just rather abandon my original plan and more point to use my time for the last question, which is about that story that everybody's talking about. The Google AI researcher found that, or he believes that a large language model designed to converse with people was actually sentient. So the question that I would like to ask is, from your perspective, how do you how do you define understand in natural language processing? Say, by what standard would you think machine can really understand language instead of simulating the ability to understand a language? So, because like now I remember when I was a student, like first we used the phrase like text mining and then natural language processing. Recently they called it natural language understanding. But then I have a tough time to understand, like, do people really define what understand here for machine? I'm just curious, like how you guys, your perspective, right? How do you define understand for a language model or conversational AI in general? Anyone want to volunteer and start first?
Everybody's a bit freaked out, right? It's just like it's kind of, what does it mean to know something? What does it? How do you define that? And that's kind of is the kind of conversation around sentience, right? It's like we prove that it understands something, and then it has thought around it, and it has ownership and agency around that thought, and it belongs to them. And is it just regurgitating, or when does it become new? And is it new based on historical? But every person does that anyway, because we learn language and we learn concepts from each other. So a majority of people are just regurgitating things they've heard elsewhere. And what does it mean to have creative thought, I guess, as well? That it's really tricky to define that. I think it's a really good question, but I think it's so hard to say, what does it even mean to know something in the first place, and how can you prove that you know something? Does it have to be new to be known, to be understood? Do you have to be able to come up with something that's never been done before in relation to the entire conceptual space around an idea, and therefore you exist because you said something new? Or I don't know, how do you define it? For that academia, I think.
Yeah, I can chime in. I think it's really a hard question and a good question. And I think there are many aspects when I would take it this way. I would say maybe it's easier to decide the machine does not understand human language than they do understand. So I think for now, we still have quite some tests that we can show the machine doesn't seem to understand human language. For example, it has been repeatedly shown that if we have some of the multi-hop reasoning questions, like something lead to B lead to C lead to D, and then A will lead to D, that type of question, multi-hop reasoning, it seems to be challenging for the machine. They couldn't break it down and then jump all those hops and arrive to the final decision, at least not consistently. And then for the conversational AI, it's also have been shown all these open domain generation or creative generation. It has been shown that the machines are oftentimes inconsistent with themselves. For example, you may have the exact same conversation yesterday and today. You say whether you like something, and it maybe yesterday they said yes, the second day they say they don't. Maybe this is if it's about preference, maybe they change in one day. But if you ask like, how old are you, or when is your birthday? Yesterday it was an answer, today is a different answer. So these inconsistency also show that they doesn't seem to understand particular things. And then I think for open domain creativity, I work a lot on these creative story generation, where we give very limited information and we challenge the machine to generate and have imagination go from there. And oftentimes we find, especially in the more formal domains, the machine will hallucinating a lot of things. Like they will say things that simply doesn't make sense for humans in terms of purely very grammatical, perfect language, but it doesn't make sense. So I felt these are and another thing is it's very hard to teach them. Like for the Human, when we say we understand each other, we have a common language, we can communicate. And then if there is something we do wrong, everyone make mistakes, right? But there will be a process that we can teach this person so that they can avoid doing something like the ethical concern or biases. Maybe everyone may have some implicit bias based on their context and their training, their education. But we can give them additional training such that they can pick it up and then they understand this concept, and the next time they won't make the same mistake. But I think for machine, it's not very clear on how can we give them training like the way we train human with like videos, principles, or like a list of items so that we give them, and then they will learn from this and consistently learn that next time I pick this up and I won't make the same mistake. It's not, it doesn't seem to happen. So I would say I take it as we can still have several tests and see whether they passed or not. If the machine passed all the tests, they may or may not have understanding, but if they fail on many of the tests, then it seems to me they may not have understanding yet.
Gotcha. That's a very good angle. Thank you for sharing that. Any other points?
Yeah, I'm a little reluctant to even participate in this discussion because it's kind of like, it's kind of giving a lot of breathing room for a question that is a very minority opinion, but I think it needs to be addressed. So one thing about language that we don't think about as much is that it's always with communicative intent. This is just our species that has developed this form of language, not to say other animals do not have, or other species do not have their own language, but our language system is built for communicative intent. This is why it has been, we have evolved to acquire language. But when we think about these models, the objectives with which these models are trained, what they are optimizing for, is to do well on a certain completion task, or to fill a particular blank well, or to get like some kind of reward at the end. Which is very, very different from the kind of communicative intent that you and I have. The other issue is that language is not something that you have in a silo. You always have context in which you are, speaking or communicating something. So this is a symposium where 5 of us have gathered to have a conversation, to communicate something about responsible AI to an audience in LA. So there is like a rich context in which we are having this conversation. Language models or foundation models, this is like completely divorced from the language that they generate is completely divorced from the context in which they are generating the language. There is no situational grounding in which this language is being produced. And when it comes to like these kinds of generated language, our own, people in the 60s, I believe, have built systems like ELIZA, which are, again, like very good communicators. Like it gives you the impression of asking very intelligent questions, but really it's what it's doing is like generating language in a very, very rule-based mechanism, which gives the impression of intelligence without really being so. So there are so many different considerations here. And I completely agree with Nanyan's in thinking that it is easier to show these inconsistencies in language than it is to show that something is actually understanding you. I am talking about language model and sentience, but the way, say, Vince understands it versus Sarthak versus Mike versus Violet might be very different. We might fixate on a particular aspect of the meaning, and that's so understanding even among us who are all human beings, it's going to be very different. So it's a very complex question, and knowing that these models are not trained to do anything more complex than finishing a pattern, it's kind of a disingenuous question to even be discussing that they have somehow acquired sentience. But unfortunately, I think we haven't done a good job in our field to communicate to outsiders how this technology or what the limitations of these technologies are. We have overhyped the capabilities without really talking about the limitations. So yeah, this kind of loops back to that very first question about like AI and media, and like there is a big responsibility in terms of scientists like myself who build these technologies, as well as folks from industry who apply these technologies, as well as folks from media who talk about these technology, to present like a more realistic picture of what this technology is.
I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Swabha. Hi, Sarthak, do you have something to add?
Honestly, I think this is a really complex question. I was just kind of biding my time because I don't necessarily have the answer, right, that maybe we're talking about. I think a lot of the points that Vince, Violet, and Swabha made, they resonate really strongly with me. I think if there was an easy answer, we would all know it by now. But I think this is definitely a very complex question, and with an even more complex answer. But I like Violet's approach, right? It's easier to say when something's not than when something maybe is.
Gotcha. Thank you all. Thank you guys very much. Yeah, this is a very tough question. I've been thinking about that since I read that news, but thank you for sharing your perspective. I am definitely the audience as well. Thank you all for participating. Myself, I have a lot more to read and to think and explore, and I hope you, the audience, feel the same. Again, thank you very much for all the panelists and the audience. That's it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good evening. Bye-bye.